Changing Chile's constitution. Referendum voters say yes to scrapping the constitution written during the military dictatorship 40 years ago. And politicians will mostly be kept out of the process to write a new one. What's prompted this change and what happens now? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. It's been 30 years since Chile emerged from a military dictatorship to become a democracy. Yet Chileans are still governed by a constitution written by General Augosto Pinochet, the military dictator who ruled in the 1970s and 80s. But that's about to change. An overwhelming 78% voted to have a new constitution written. And they rejected a proposal to leave that job to the politicians. Sunday's referendum was the culmination of a year of protests focused on inequality in one of Latin America's wealthiest countries. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment. But first, our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, has more from the capital, Santiago.
A massive celebration to mark the end of the last vestige of Chile's former military dictatorship. We've won, chorused this family, in the same part of Santiago that became the epicenter of protests for more than a year. Millions of Chileans who've been calling for profound social reforms had demanded a new constitution to replace the one written 40 years ago under the military dictatorship. Dressed in his Sunday best, 90-year-old Julio Carrasco went to vote in his working-class neighborhood. Not even concerns about the coronavirus pandemic could keep him at home.
I've never had a historic opportunity like this before and never will again. It's the first time that we get to participate in the creation of a constitution, that we can have an input in the judicial structure of our country instead of having it imposed. I only hope I live to see the new Chile.
On the other side of town, members of the youngest generation of voters were excited about having cast a ballot for the very first time.
This is the first institutionalized change or election that I have ever been convinced it's going to work. Because, well, this is a very important change for Chile. Apruebo.
When the vote counting began, it was clear that Chileans, by an overwhelming majority, had approved the formation of a constituent assembly whose delegates will be chosen by popular vote and with gender parity. They will ultimately be the ones to draft the new constitution, a process that could take 2 years.
There was never much doubt about which choice Chileans would make. But now that it's official that Chileans will be writing a new constitution, the big question is, will they have the patience to wait for that change that they've just voted for to take place?
Opponents of the decision fear it will create false expectations and lead to economic instability, which will only fan more social unrest.
I'm concerned about the way this has been generated. We need change, but not so drastically, more calmly.
Conservative President Sebastián Piñera, who'd hoped for a very different outcome, conceded defeat in a conciliatory message to the country.
Until now, the Constitution has divided us. From today, we must all work together so that the new Constitution is the great framework of unity, stability and future.
It's unlikely that this referendum will put social demands for a more inclusive country on hold. But at least for now, many of those who'd lost hope of change in the future feel they have achieved an important victory. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
Let's bring in our guests. Marta Largos is a political analyst and she joins us from Santiago. Eric Farnsworth is Vice President at the Council of the Americas and he joins us from Washington, D.C. Boris van der Speck is the Editor-in-Chief of the English language news site Chile Today and he also joins us from Chile's capital. Welcome all. I'd like to begin in Santiago with you, Marta Largos. There's been a lot of talk about this being a complete fresh change for Chile, that this is dismantling the legacy of General Augosto Pinochet. But what is the real driving force behind this? Is it the constitution was unfair, or did people just want a change?
Well, I think one must understand what the constitution meant for these 30 years. The constitution had these very high majorities of 4/5, 5/7, 2/3 that were necessary to pass an enormous amount of subjects and laws in order to produce change. So that we have had, for example, laws that have taken 3 parliaments, 10 years to be passed in parliament. I think this constitution has slowed the pace of change that Chile would have needed in order to become a developed country. There's no reason why we are not a developed country with the PGB we have. And I think the new constitution needs to install rules that make it possible to produce change as time goes along. I mean, the American Constitution has 25 amendments, and this constitution has had 49 changes in these 30 years, and is still not, has not been able to done away with these enormous majorities that are necessary to change almost everything. So I think, you know, from the political point of view, this is the most important change that the Constitution has brought about, and the reason why changes have not occurred. We need to change the pension system, the health system, the education system, and the changes that have been needed have not been able to be done because of this conditions in this constitution.
Let me bring in Boris van der Speck here. This was very much a change that was driven not just by young people, but predominantly by young people coming out onto the streets, protesting, both peacefully and sometimes violently as well. But the Chilean leader, Sebastián Piñera, was hoping for a very different outcome. So he's now got to reconcile his need for things to remain the same with this overwhelming desire for change, particularly from young people, right?
Definitely. And I think the leadership, especially from politicians, is going to be important for the next couple of years to come when the Constitution is going to be written. Because what has been shown in this referendum, it was not only for or against the new Constitution, also who is going to be the ones to draft this new Constitution. And Chile has shown that it's completely not trusting its politicians to draft this new Constitution. So basically what Piñera right now has to do is make sure that the whole process of electing new representatives in this assembly will go smoothly. But later on, I mean, already in November, new presidential elections will be held. So his only task right now is to make sure this process and all the elections to come, because the electoral agenda is quite full for the next couple of months, is going well. And after that, well, what is it, March, February 2022, he will be replaced by someone else. So for now, he is just to step back and to make sure everything goes well, because of course his name, his reputation, his entire political agenda has been completely disturbed, not only by the social protests, but also by the pandemic, economic problems between the United States and China. For him, I think his mandate is basically over. He doesn't need to step down, but he just needs to make sure everything that's to come, especially those elections, go well.
Eric Farnsworth, I am going to come to you in just a moment, but I'd like to go back to Marta Largos in Santiago as well. There are a lot of people expecting that this is the silver bullet, that this will change things for the better, but it's not as simple as that, particularly when it comes to economic problems in Chile, unemployment, etc. Those things are structural changes that will take perhaps even a generation.
Well, yes. In fact, I think there's 2 main changes to be done. One can be done through the Constitution, which is the dispersion of power. I mean, power needs to be more horizontal and not so hierarchical. We are a very traditional society, and we need to modernize in the sense of who decides what when, and that can be written in the Constitution. And the other thing is taxes. We need a very, very strong tax reform in order to empower the state so that we can install social guarantees. When transition was done in 1990, people expected two things: political guarantees, freedom of speech, basically, and the right to go about and vote, etc., and social guarantees. The Chilean transition has been able to assure political guarantees, but it has not been able to assure social guarantees. Chileans have a PhD in politics. They know this is not going to happen in one day, but we need to start the road. We need to start, untangling the traffic jam in the middle of the tunnel. We need to start marching towards the mouth of the tunnel. And I think that's the key to the social unrest. And yesterday, on Sunday, was, I think, the first step. And I think the process will be a little bit messy, but it will go in the right direction. I have no doubt this country will go in the right direction.
Eric Farnsworth, we are looking at what might be a messy transition, but democracy is very rarely easy or clean. But what does this mean for the region? What does this mean? Are we expecting a South American spring, for example?
Well, Imran, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the first thing to say as an outsider observing the Chilean process is that this really did seem to be a celebration of democracy. The vote was handled freely and fairly without violence. As has been mentioned, almost 80% of the people voted in favor of change. And clearly, this is something that has been a long time coming in the Chilean context. And so from that perspective, it was a very interesting result and something that I think there's a lot to build on. It's very easy, though, to vote for change. The question now comes, and your question about democracy being messy is exactly right. The question now comes, what kind of change? And I think that's the balance that the Chilean system is going to have to come through with, because there are a lot of competing interests. And once you open up that door to fundamental change, possibly, then a lot of things begin to be possible. But a lot of folks begin to resist some of those activities as well. So I do think that there needs to be somewhat of a balance. But having said that, Chile, again, from an outsider's perspective, has been seen for many years as somewhat of a model for Latin America, certainly economically, certainly in terms of the strength of its democracy. Political parties change leadership all the time, freely and fairly. And the country has a very good relationship with its neighbors for the most part, certainly with the United States and with other countries around the world. So there's a lot here to be proud of. There's a lot to be focused on for the future. Whether it's a model for the rest of the region, I don't know if it is or not. I mean, clearly a positive model in the sense that democracy can work. Democracy isn't always clean or perfect, but it can work and it can solve problems. But the Chilean model is also in some ways a little bit unique from the rest of the region. So I think that needs to be taken into account as well.
Well, let's talk about that uniqueness of the Chilean model. Marta, one of the interesting things, certainly for me, about this referendum is the fact that people voted to get citizens to try and change the constitution rather than leaving it in the hands of politicians, which, perhaps shows a lack of trust in the politicians. I mean, what do you think?
Well, you see, we started the transition in 1990 with very high levels of 60%, 70% of people trusting democratic institutions like parliament and political parties. Just around 1996, this number dropped to 20. And ever since 1996 until today, we have had a floating distrust of about 80 to 85, 90% of the people distrusting political parties and parliament. And I think the distrust comes from this unanswered demand of social guarantees. I mean, people were expecting a lot of democracy. Chileans want democracy. There is about 70% of support for democracy. There is no way somebody can say that democracy has been at risk at any point of the protest. People want more democracy, not less democracy. And they don't trust politicians to be democratic enough. In fact, 70% of the people say that these governments, these last governments, and the last 4 or 5 governments have defended the minorities and not the majorities. So we need to turn this over and show people that governments govern for the majority. And this is what we call the dispersion of power that the new constitution needs to install. For example, one very clear example is decentralization of political decisions that are taken all in Santiago de Chile and not in the region. So that you have this, anything that has to be done in this country, you need to come to the presidential palace and talk it over with the main ministers. Well, that's one of the things that needs to be updated. You need to be able to let the regions that are very diverse. We have the driest desert in the north, the desert on the earth, and then on the south, it's a very wet weather. So, you know, you have different geographies, different people, different, and we have the Indians, we have the Mapuches, which have not been allowed to be themselves for 500 years. So I need, you know, this is one very important part of the recognition of the diversity we have within the country that needs to be written in the constitution, and it is not. Chile has been a very centralized country, and everything happens within 4 walls. And this is what's being kicked out. This is the mantle that's been, you know, thrown away. People don't want that anymore. People want to participate. They want direct.
Marta, I'm just going to bring in Eric. Marta, I'm going to bring in Eric Farnsworth here. Eric, Marta seems to be quite positive about this, saying, look, this is a real change that will eventually represent the whole of Chile, not just the centre of power. But when you have citizens elected to try and change the constitution, there will be political influence that's going to have to be managed. And we've seen this in other countries. What can the international community do to help Chile, or is this just simply an internal matter?
Well, again, I think you're exactly right. You know, it depends now who's at the table to actually draft this constitution and to see what the delegates come up with. That's a process that will begin sometime later next year. What can the international community do? Not much, to be honest, nor should we. This is a Chilean issue for Chilean citizens, a strong democracy, strong sovereign nation. Certainly from the U.S. perspective, to the extent we can be supportive of a democratic process, I think that's appropriate. I do think there's also a role for the international community to have a sensitivity to the moment of change in Chile, but also of the economic model that Chile has had, which has proven to be a success and has proven to be supported by particularly North American, but also other investors and folks who are working to help the economy and the business community within Santiago and Chile as well. And so the point that I'm making is that I do think there has to be a balance. Like in any country, there are going to be competing interests, and how those interests are arrayed against each other is a matter for the Chilean people. But once the outcome is determined, then the international community will take a look, particularly from the economic side, and say, well, this is something that either we want to move forward with or perhaps change some of the views. So that's an issue, I think, for the Chilean people primarily.
Boris van der Speck, we are in a moment in Chile where it's a celebratory atmosphere. People are hopeful for the future. But as we know, that doesn't last that long, particularly if change doesn't come, concrete change isn't seen to be coming. So given that you speak to a lot of Chilean people, you speak to a lot of people in the journalistic community, is there a chance that may be missed here because simply it might just take too long?
Well, I think there's nothing to be missed here because, of course, this is the first step in the whole process of writing this new constitution. But what I think is very important is to manage these expectations, because what you do see when you talk to people on the streets during the protests, during the celebrations on Sunday, is that there is a sensation that a new constitution really might change the lives of a lot of people who have not seen the profits of all those economic growth in the last couple of years in Chile. And I think it's very important to manage those expectations, because Chile has shown that with protests they can change a country, with mobilizations, with manifestations, and I think it's very important that they know what they can expect in the next couple of years, that the people involved in writing the Constitution will do so in a certain transparent process. And also, something that was to be seen in the first months of the protests last year were these small gatherings of citizens coming together in parks, on plazas, in cafes, and just talk together. Okay, how are we going to change the country? There was a huge participation of citizens at that moment. And what I think is very important to make those people who made sure that Chile can write a new constitution right now get included as well in drafting a new constitution. Of course, not by writing it directly, but that through some form there will be an input of all citizens to make sure that the constitution.
But Boris, what you're talking about, Boris van der Speck, what you're talking about is almost a decade-long process. This isn't going to happen immediately. And I asked Marta a question earlier. This isn't a silver bullet that's going to change people's lives straight away. Isn't that going to be a problem?
Well, this is exactly what I mentioned with that the process of writing the Constitution should be very transparent, that expectations should be managed by both politicians and by those writing the Constitution, and also by getting people, normal people, again, not those we see on the television, involved in writing the Constitution, not directly, but at least get them a platform where they can transmit their ideas, where they can tell what they think should be included, because otherwise we might see it in 2 years or in 3 years, people go back to the streets because they still haven't seen any change yet. Of course, it's a process that takes very long time. I mean, these people who are going to write a constitution have possibly very little experience writing a new constitution, but have to do so in 1 year or 1.5 years. So to make sure that process and the change that comes after goes well and that people see some of it, I think it's very important to keep including all the citizens that voted on Sunday.
Marta Largos, you mentioned earlier, it's a great phrase, that the Chilean people have a PhD in politics, that they understand the process and they understand that it might take a little while, but how much goodwill is there? You know, if this does take 5, 6, 7, maybe a decade, I mean, that goodwill is going to run out, surely.
Yes, but, you know, if you look at the process, for example, in Brazil, when President Lula took office the first time and he installed this no hunger program, he didn't need to show the whole country that this was happening. It just happened in a very particular place to a very particular group of people. And that was enough to show that there was political will to get out of there. I think, you know, as I said, you know, Chile has a PhD in politics, and people will understand and they will be able to see transparently whether this is going to happen or not. We need to be able to show there is a political will to do things differently in favor of the good, the common good, and not in favor of political or particular interest. I think the entrepreneurs...
Sorry, Marta, we are running out of time, and I do want to just quickly come back to Eric Farnsworth. Now, you've heard from two people there, Eric, in Santiago, who were involved in the constitutional change, in the protests, in everything almost. Do you still think that this is an internal Chilean matter, or do you think Chile could do with some help?
Well, I mean, to the extent that the folks who are actually writing the Constitution are looking for models or ideas, certainly there's a lot out there. The history and tradition of democracy is rich with positive examples and examples, frankly, to be avoided as well. So that's, I think, that can be drawn from history, certainly. But one has to be careful. Look, particularly from a Washington perspective, from a United States perspective, this has to be a Chilean process. To the extent the Chilean people seek assistance in some manner, I think that folks can be open to that. But, you know, Imran, you asked earlier a really important question, I think, about, you know, could this be a model for the rest of the region? And in some ways, as I mentioned, Chile is unique. But in another way, I think it's a very important potential model. And we've seen changes come to other countries in Latin America violently or suddenly, or anti-constitutionally or in a manner that disrupts democracy. Clearly, if the Chilean people can pull this off in a way that updates the Constitution, does so according to a democratic process freely and transparently, and comes out on the other side satisfying, perhaps not completely, but satisfying most interests in the country, that will be a tremendous success as Chileans work out their democracy from generation to generation.
Eric Farnsworth, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Boris van der Spek and Marta Largos for joining us. Thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.